cycle as these numbers and the months and the weeks went by of so many years, of 52-year cycles that would then be, the bigger wheel on the left here is actually the 52-year cycles, and this would go on in such a way so that they could predict events hundreds or if not thousands of years into the future if they were calculating enough. So this was quite surprising that the Maya, who had no wheel, no gunpowder, no metal, could develop this kind of advanced mathematical and astronomical estimation. So it led to this comment. No, 30 days hath September. Well, I guess it's only funny in some languages, but these were the hallmarks of the civilization, and it also continued through later centuries to the Aztecs and others. And then there's been some remnant of the literature left. Of course, this was mostly an oral culture, but the Popul, if you've ever seen this rather slim book of kind of fantasy, it's about two little baby boys who are brought to the sky god to join forces as semi-heroes and fight the forces of evil and have all these adventures. It's sort of a combination of Huckleberry Finn and Lord of the Rings. But if you read it in its translations, it doesn't have much flavor. And perhaps it should be made into a cartoon or a major action movie. And so there's a lot we just don't know. This rather kind of florid way of writing, and then the many versions of these stories that are in the living languages of the Maya are pretty hard for us to get a hold of, let's say. And that's why, let's say, Mayan culture has never been had any, let's say, intellectual impact on the rest of the world, unlike many other ancient civilizations. But nonetheless, as they find more, they are kind of like a giant puzzle trying to understand why and how this happened. So this is the Bonapuk tomb, which features these very colorful frescoes. Here's probably a warrior captured, pleading for his life. The king in the center with his great staff and jaguar Quetzalcoatl headdress, and the warriors with their feathers and such. So if it was half as colorful as this, it must have been quite a sight, particularly when you add a parade of trumpets, and then on the right you have these fellows dressed up like lobsters, unless they are a hybrid, who knows. But there's just no knowledge of much of it, except you can see in things that are clear. The woman in the center is pulling a thorn string through her tongue to offer blood to the Lord. And this was often depicted. Here's Lady Hook before the shield jaguar ruler of Yaxchitlan. She also is pulling a ritual bloodletting as honorific. Now, this is not apparent in the stone as much, but when they transfer to a line drawing, you can see what she's doing. And this has been depicted many times. Now, we may have strange customs, but this is particularly unusual. But some things are more, let's say, familiar and gentle. Here's Ixchel, the moon goddess, who was the counterpart, supposedly married to the sun god. And this is ceramic, where she seems quite calm and mellow. Her moon has been called the rabbit, and there was a display somewhere that said many cultures around the world have looked at the full moon and they've seen a rabbit in it, and this was one of the features of Mayan culture also. So she would have her rabbit, and she would try to scurry across the sky before the sun took over, and there are tales of this in the Mayan codexes. This was the goddess of love or fertility, Xochiquetzal, and she has the quetzal feathers all over her, and was perhaps worshipped by, for instance, up on the top there's somebody having their head cut off, just hoping to be more fertile. I went to a small site in Yucatan a number of years ago in a dusty town with a truck stop and a gas station and all this, and there was a mound of rocks in the middle, and I was asking them, what's this little stela? I mean, it was about maybe 50 feet high and had a staircase up to it. And they said, oh, that's the old temple to the goddess of of love. And the locals said that the priests would stay up on the top of the temple, and the women would all gather around, and they would beg the priest to take their one of their children, particularly a young girl, for sacrifice. And then when the priest decided which one was worthy, would take it up and tear her heart out. And this was considered a great honor to the family, and also, again, bloodletting to encourage prosperity or fertility or just a continuance. Well, in this case, we have just the more mundane maize god, the corn god, which is still, let's say, somewhat of a living god because he's prayed to with every harvest and every planting season. And it comes in many images, usually with corn popping out all over him. And of course, this is the great staple of the Mayan and the great gift of the Americas to the rest of the world. Here's a platter for tortillas, and you can see the corn god is working on his recipes, I guess. And here's a cup that features, again, the corn god, but they would make corn beer, which is made in various places with many different names to this day, made fresh. And so they keep finding more of these kind of highly graphic ceramics that give a very palpable sense of how, let's say, highly developed the ceramics and the painting are. But they never cast in metal. This looks like a Chinese ancient bronze pot, but it's all ceramic. But to make that as a ceramic is pretty complicated. It may have only been a ceremonial cup and not a fire underneath like a metal one might have. This cup had rattles on it, so whenever you drank, you got all this rattly sound. And here's somebody who had too much at the luncheon buffet, obviously. It was used for storage of food. But you can see the careful incisions and features of it. And more, they just keep finding more. And there's others that are identified with Tolmec and Aztec, and all through Mexico, they just keep finding more than they ever thought would have been made. And again, another drinking vessel. And this we can still see, the huichol weaving. I mean, they demonstrated at all these different sites, but it's a common Mayan tradition to weave your own cloth like this, and this is a living tradition nowadays. Oops. But it's this way now with much more of a, say, a larger looms, and that one before is the back strap. They will just put it against and they pull it back, and that'll create the tension to make the cloth. But you've already seen some of the fine weavings that they do all the time. I just bought this shirt for my son, but I realize an extra large for a Maya is extra small for me. But these all have symbology. The stripes usually identify the group of the Maya. So everyone wears a different one, and when they go traveling, they can be readily identified from being up in the highlands of Guatemala or the lowlands of Belize or wherever they're from. Here's an illustration of some of the human adornments, all of the feather dresses and the heavy jewelry. But note on the lower left-hand side, the infants would get this head strap so that it would flatten their forehead and create a sloping forehead, and that was considered a sign of beauty. They don't do it anymore. But for all these kings and priests and wars and all that, the people had a normal life such as it was with music. I was playing earlier some of the pre-Columbian music from the area, which was a lot of flutes and ocarinas and conch shells and drums and some horns and things. Of course, we don't have any recordings from back then, but you see what's in their hand standing. It looks like a cane. That's actually what they call a rain stick. It's a hollow, can be bamboo or some sort of reed that'll be capped off at either end, and then it'll have little stones or in it, and then little sort of like skewers all through it. And when you turn that, it makes the sound of rain. So in the midst of all this, you turn the stick over and it sounds like it's raining. And they had games and juggling and acrobats probably from what they found in the tombs. But this came to its public display mostly at these great plazas. And so there was a game called Popul, which was to get a hard rubber ball through that ring up in the high part of the court, but you couldn't use your hands or feet. You had to use everything else and kind of kick it around, but people became incredibly adept at playing a ball game with no hands or any feet. And this goes on today. Here's the modern version of it. Curiously, these would be very well-attended, let's say, sports of the time. But the curious thing that I've read, whether it's true, is the winner would be sacrificed. It was a great honor to win and then to die. That is not what they do in World Cup football. At least I don't think so these days. But here's the player again from China of the Pauahtun ball. Now that ball is made of cured latex, and this is one of the things that has endured from the Mayan heritage, is rubber and then balls. And so even next time you're out in the ball court or watching a game, remember that the rubber ball came from the Maya. And they also brought us that great thing called tobacco, which is a Caribbean, of course, American, what they call the devil's weed. And one of the Spaniards said, it takes the devil to make a person breathe fire. And of course it became more popular than it should have maybe. But and the other thing is they made this corn beer, which is in Mexico called pulque. So here's another ceramic of a fellow who obviously is wondering whether he should have one more. But this is a fresh brew that is famous for turning sour, and then it gets you kind of crazy. And they make it also out of agave and other substances that have become tequila and things that we know today. But part of the problem with this particular drink is it makes people violent. And so before a war or maybe after a war, people would drink too much and then they would be a little unpolite. Now, when you go out into this whole area, you look at these mountains, and a lot of them actually have a temple in them. You know, you start imagining these things when you're out there in the steamy jungle. But they keep digging out more and finding, layers going back in time as they go down. And so they've reconstructed some of the old towns that they've found in various parts. So this was Aguateca, which was found in the South Yucatan. And it was on the bend of a river with a cliff. And now it had been all overgrown with jungle, but it had once been cleared with a whole town, a ceremonial city, thousands of people. But the evidence of it was of a great battle. It was the entrance to the town was guarded by bridges over this gorge, so they were impenetrable from the riverside, and one side on the gorge, the other side was the river. So they had a pretty strong strategic place, but they were invaded and sacked, and they found the remains of the burnt buildings and armaments and things like this there. So this was illustrative of the warfare that then ended up either depopulating the population or causing the kind of collapse of city after city that then led to no more commerce and things. And then, just as it all faded out, actually, 889 was the last inscription found in Mayan. So it was another 500-600 years before the conquistadores and the other Europeans came. But then at that time, the Maya had been a failed state, and the Aztecs were the strong ones, and there were a lot of conflict between all the others. But then the Spanish came in and then had their way. That's a whole story to itself, but that became the double tragedy of the Mayan people, because they were enslaved if they didn't cooperate, but most of them died of smallpox and other diseases that the Europeans brought. But here's some conversion therapy, I'd call, being done on the poor natives. And they had a large uprising in 1830 to 47 when the Mayan all through Yucatan down into Guatemala had enough, and they had a couple of charismatic leaders who then led an army against the Spanish and then the Mexicans in this case. And so town after town was sacked, and a great deal of blood was shed, but they were fully suppressed. And at that time, you could say that the Mayan culture was dispersed into the hills and put to work, but have remained to this day. So here's in this later period when plantations owned by Spanish and Mexicans came in and they put all the Mayan to work. Here they are getting their accounts checked by the plantation owners. So this is an example where often the hardworking Maya just had a different set of masters and a different religion to go with it. But you can see yourself today and tomorrow, and as we've seen, the Maya are a living culture, and they have a very distinctive look to them. Not that they're flattening their head or dressed up in feathers or anything, but they're very short and stocky and very strong. And DNA studies on them have shown that going back into time, because they were living in a place with this limestone aquifer, that it had certain minerals that stunted their growth but made their bones very strong to the point where they could have a very strong physique. And so often they're only, maybe 1.5 meters high or whatever the measure would be, but they were smaller than many other people, and they remain that way. But we are out in the countryside today. You can see the traditional house, whether it has mud walls or not. A lot of them have open or thatch, but this is called the na. And it would have a fire in the center and a dirt floor. But it had this palm thatch roof, which meant that all the heat would be drawn out and through the roof. So this was a much more suitable kind of architecture for this climate, and to the point where everywhere we go we see more of these being built, and you can go stay at a luxury one if you want. But the other problem of the whole area is environmental decay, because after the troubles going back a millennia or more, now the jungle had grown up, and now it is being cut back down again for all the purposes of agriculture or timbering. But this line you see right in the middle, that's the Mexican-Guatemalan border, and to the right of it is the biosphere of Petén, they call it, which is, they're trying to hold on to the old growth forest, but everything in Mexico is already being stripped bare and becoming, like northern Yucatan, a desert. And so even though the people are still there, they're under, let's say, diminishing resources. I mentioned this the other day. You have a doubling of the population all through this past century, and then the forest cover being cut slowly and surely so that you only get some sticks for firewood. And the life has become more and more difficult, particularly when they know that there's all this comfort and opportunity elsewhere. So the Mayan are sort of ruining the day when they were once a mighty empire, if very unfair, but now they are, let's say, struggling to even be poor. And someone was asking, what do the local countries and the local society think about the Maya? Well, they usually don't think about them, because those are just those poor Indians that should get out of the way. And the biggest problem is that the outsiders come in and just take their land. They get them to sign a document, or they have multiple titles for the land. And this is great part of the reason why Guatemala particularly fell into this bitter civil wars, because the Maya's traditional land was being ever more taken from them, and under the boot of the modern civilization, let's say. And a lot of them, of course, they speak Spanish. I mean, today we were talking in fluent English to a couple of the Maya from Belize, and they are fairly adaptable. They usually can speak 2 or 3 Mayan languages. It's sort of like, French, Spanish, and Italian between them. And then they also will learn, Spanish or English, or, a lot of them are very quick students. But they've been constantly, let's say, assaulted economically or else directly, and these are children's drawings from the Civil War in Guatemala. I showed you Rigoberta Menchu's picture before, the Nobel Prize-winning Mayan, who's still alive and still advocating for the rights of her people. So things have actually gotten better, especially because of the archaeology has knowledge, and the appreciation for that ancient past has come down to a point of pride for the current generations. And now they are allowed to speak Maya and learn it in school, rather than being forced to only speak in Spanish. So there's perhaps a regeneration of the culture with maybe more resources and some sense of justice to them, but they're still pretty much hardworking peasants growing corn. And here's a modern hanging that I actually have in my house, which was of a corn god that they make and offer as a souvenir. And there's music again. I played the one version of the flute music. This is what they call a Mayan harpist who is probably adapted from the Spanish, but it's string music that is sung in Mayan. This is from right here in Belize. Up in the Guatemalan highlands, that's where you see the most exuberant of all the festivals and gatherings of the mountain people, market days. So if you've never been up there to Lake Atitlan and Chichicastenango, those are kind of the one place in the Americas other than maybe Peru where you can go and get a pretty complete native culture that's growing and vibrant and happy somewhat. This is one thing they do up there is they fly these tremendous kites up over the mountains as part of the festival. Usually it's on a Catholic Saints' Day or festival that has Christianity involved, but a lot of it is more and more going back to some Mayan roots. Jaguar festivals, El Pocho they call this. Then in 1990s, the Guatemalan government allowed the Mayan shamans and healers to go back to have ceremonies at their sites, and this is in Tikal, where they gather around a large fire and they burn a special sacred wood that gives off this kind of pungent smoke. And now you can go have holistic health retreats with Mayan herbalists, and all of this is sort of coming back out of the woods because the ancient tradition may have been pretty much forgotten, but it is, like in some places, being recreated almost. And so here's a wake for deceased where they sit in the room, they dress the deceased all up, and it is nominally Catholic, but it goes back to some of the most ancient of the Mayan practices. They used to bury their dead at the foot of a major tree, expecting then the spirit would go up and then go to heaven through the leaves. So again, it's tree worship, and they don't do this now, supposedly, but maybe they will again. So here you have more new generation who want to be part of the world, but they are proudly Mayan in many ways, and they're even playing the old Pocho game. Now it's called Ulama, where these little it's really a gymnastic sport. So they don't kick or throw the ball. They use their hips and their head to match the ball and win the game. And they have other versions of that, as in basketball. So we would hope that this people that were almost reduced to extinction can survive and sort of be given their due and their rights and their pride. And so I've been told by some of them that they would like to be an independent nation again, called Mayaland or whatever it would be called in their languages. The problem is that there are many of them in many languages. So it's as a people that were never under central national authority, now they're divided between these other countries, and so I doubt if it'll ever come to a national status again. But if they have their livelihood and their pride in their culture, that's good, and that's part of why we're here. This is the latest aliens to come visit this universe, and it has good effects and maybe not so good, because we get to go out and see these people and see these sites that were 50 years ago not even known about, and then provide some income to the local people. And of course it can get pretty big, and so Mexico in particular has developed Cancun and all these other sites to bring in the great flood of visitors. And I don't want to talk about Cancun other than it's lost its beach lately. But this site in Tulum, which is just south of Cancun, was the temple to Hurricana, who is the god of the wind. And we use that god's name to this day as hurricane. And so this was to provide sacrifices and offerings to the wind god so that the storms would stay away. And it's a beautiful site, not a very big or a major one, but it has this overlook of the sea, which is unique amongst all of the Mayan ruins. But in December of 2012, the calendar that I showed you, which was on its 52-year cycle over thousands of years, it came clicking around to what they considered the beginning of the world again on, I think, a 6,000-year cycle. I don't know the number. And at that time, thousands of natives, Mayan, but especially even more spiritualists and hippies and seekers, went down there to see the sunrise out of the sea on the day when the world was supposed to end. But fortunately, like most raptures and apocalypses, the end of the world has been postponed due to technical difficulties. And so we have the pleasure of visiting here and appreciating the Mayan culture and also its continued life. And I hope you get to know a bit and appreciate a bit more as we are here. Anyway, thank you very much.